All right, and so today's video, we're talking about why did Europe begin amassing great empires in the late 19th century. So for those of you who are in AP World, this is a good video to listen to because you're also kind of reviewing stuff from AP World. And for those of you that are in AP US, this will just be basically a review of stuff you've already know. I will say, before I start doing this, my video, this PowerPoint somehow has all sorts of wonkadoo, and I didn't have time to fix it, and I don't know why it saved weirdly, so bear with me if it looks kind of strange. So, first question is, why did 19th century imperialism begin? Now, European civilization, as we know, they like to fight with each other. They're constantly at war with each other, and they always had a tendency to try to expand. So 60 years after the defeat of Napoleon, there really was not any significant colonial rivalries originally. They had free trade. There was no need to politically dominate areas that one traded with. But during this time, we see that France starts moving into Algeria, Britain begins strengthening its empire in India, the Netherlands develops Java, and the Western powers open Japan and then start moving into China. Between 1870 and 1880, the colonial question begins to become larger. By 1900, basically, the European countries are pretty much partitioned to hold on Earth. So we see here in India, the British Raj. This is the new Empress of India receiving the crown of her empire. And here are some of the aims of the French foreign policy. They wanted to regain the provinces of, good old Alsace-Lorraine, which they lost to Germany in 1871. They wanted to end her isolation in international affairs that happened after the Franco-Prussian War. And they want to expand their colonial empire and regain some of her prestige after the loss of the Franco-Prussian War. So this, to the French, was the loss of Alsace-Lorraine was a complete national trauma. So this is going to push them to start to create their colonial empire. So the French colonial empire was set up under the Third Republic. It's the greatest the French have ever going to possess. Jules Ferry, who was the president of France, plays a huge role in empire building. And 2/3 of the missionary priests outside of Europe were French. By 1914, France was the second largest colonial power in the world and the largest in Africa. And you can see here, everything in green is the land that was controlled by the French. Now the British, though, of course the sun never sets in the British Empire, so essentially Britain's everywhere, and they have their hands in many, many places all across the globe. But so how did the economy of Europe encourage imperialism? Now, the Europeans were not going to be able to maintain their very fabulous lifestyle without exploiting the world. So the Catholic and Protestant churches sent missionaries out to various remote parts of the world. And in a lot of instances, they're going to bother the native people, and sometimes they get killed. And then once word would reach Europe, the people would call for political action to end this barbarism because these missionaries were going into places where they were not welcome and were not asked for, and then they got angry that they weren't treated properly, or the way they felt they should be treated. With the increased knowledge of science, this gave the Europeans the ability to study and explore different parts of the world, and the wealthy traveled more since it was becoming so easy, and they expected, as they traveled, to enjoy security and safety. The Europeans also required material goods that could only be produced in the tropics, like coffee, tea, cotton, rubber, petroleum, jute, and coconuts. So they needed new markets. Because the rest of Europe and America and Japan were becoming industrialized, they were running out of trading partners. So they needed to find new markets. Because prices were declining, because everyone was industrialized, people had to sell more to make a profit. Countries were raising tariffs to try to protect their own economies. And so and the colonial empires are going to become dependent upon themselves, and they're going to become vital. And this is something that's known as neo-mercantilism. So by the 1900, industry was well established. Many people had a great deal of money, and they wanted to make more. So they would invest in what they refer to as the backward countries at a higher rate of return, because you'd have cheap labor, and there'd be a large demand for non-European goods, and there was a great risk of loss, so there was a great money to be made. And they needed goods from foreign markets to support their populations and their high standards of living. So, how did this economic motivation lead to political and social motivations for imperialism? By 1914, a quarter of all British wealth, about $20 billion, was invested abroad. And there was a desire amongst the European investors that they should be asserting political dominance over these governments where they have so much money invested. So basically, this idea was that for Britain, they needed a great self-sustaining and self-protecting empire. And they didn't want to compete. They didn't want complete independence for Canada, for New Zealand, for Australia. So they wanted to try to set up an imperial federation to pool their resources for military and economic well-being. And so that's when the British are going to create the Commonwealth of Nations. This was after World War I. The Western worker benefited from imperialism because they had higher wages and they had an influx of inexpensive goods. And the competitive nature of the European powers meant that they had to guard their security against each other. So if one place is going to have colonies, they have to have colonies. And they needed to maintain the balance of power. So they would annex areas of Africa, because if they didn't, another country would. So some countries just took places because they didn't want other countries to get it. So the colonies became a symbol of greatness. Britain and France had colonies, so if you were going to be a new power, you needed to have colonies too. And so imperialism also became this crusade of the quote-unquote white man's burden in their goal to try to civilize the world. So the next question is, why was Africa partitioned? And so here you can see, this is from 1869, Disraeli pushing for the completion of the Suez Canal. Gladstone opposed, by the way, this mad scramble. But in 1881, we have the first Boer War in South Africa. And here you could see the push for land in the Sudan. But so the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869 made Egypt vitally important because, again, it provides the shortest route to India. And under the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli in Britain, he purchased a major but not controlling interest in the canal in 1875. Egypt, as we know, was very unstable, and these internal issues in Egypt were threatening the stability of Egypt in the 1880s, so the British established control, and then they moved south to the Sudan, which is in this slide right here. France began involved in Africa in 1830 by sending an expedition to attack pirates in Algiers. And France gradually expanded control, and many French began to move there. We talked about this at AP World. In 1882, to prevent Italy from taking over Tunisia, the French took over Tunisia. And then they annexed much of West Africa, Congo, and Madagascar. Remember, there's the Congos. There's the Democratic Congo, and there's the Kingdom of the Congo. Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Italy began expanding their own holdings in Africa. By the 1880s, this had compelled Britain to expand northward from the Cape of Good Hope into Zimbabwe and Zambia. Britain would make strategic moves to kind of block France, and others wanted to strengthen their own importance. So that's why Germany, under Bismarck, pursued imperialism for political motives. In 1884 and 1885, they declared protectorates over Southwest Africa, Togoland, the Cameroons, and East Africa. These areas were not valuable to Germany, but they didn't have strategic importance. Bismarck really didn't have any interest in colonies. His concern was Germany's diplomatic position, and by Germany having colonies, that gave Germany strength. And so Germany's annexation started a wide scramble for what was left of Africa, and by 1890, Africa had been completely divided. Let's move on to China for a second. So how was China divided up? So in Asia, Japan was beginning to gain power, which frightened a lot of people in Europe because they thought that Japan had set its eyes on China. The Russians at the time were building a railroad to Vladivostok, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and they didn't want China to be able to threaten their railroad and their ability to kind of control the area. So France and Germany is going to put diplomatic pressure on Japan to force them out of the Liaodong Peninsula in northern China. In 1899, the U.S. comes up with the idea of the open door policy, which opposed foreign annexations and allowed nations to trade on equal terms. And as the idea gained support, it was only Russia that was opposed because Russia was fearful of their position in China. But basically, China gets carved up, and you could see it. This is a very famous political cartoon kind of showing this. You have Queen Victoria and Bismarck, and then French guy. Oh, God, the woman with the red hat is French. I don't know who. the guy in green would be. But then the guy in the end is Japan. And you see the Chinese kind of standing there back like, no, 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 don't carve us up. As they're all kind of making these decisions of where all this land is going to go. Oh, the guy in the green is Russia. Sorry. He's the Russian czar. Kind of making all these decisions of what's going to happen to China without, consulting China in any way, shape, or form. So the last question is, how was new imperialism different from old imperialism? And so imperialism in the 19th century was different economically and politically from colonialism of like the 18th century. The older empires were maritime and mercantile, and they brought goods that were locally produced, and they really didn't have desire for territory beyond their various different trading centers. New imperialism was different. They had so much invested, much more invested financially, and they were more involved politically. They wanted goods and supplies that could not be produced by hand. They took over the production of the country. They basically transformed the people into wage earners, and they imposed their own methods and way of life on the people. Some countries were made into colonies. Others were made into protectorates, where the European country maintained the traditional leader, but commissioners from the mother country would kind of tell them what to do. China, of course, was divided into spheres of influence, which divided them up between many different countries, each controlling only its own sphere, while the country still supposedly maintained its independence. This is what we were talking about in AP World with Sun Yat-sen, kind of talking about this whole idea of the hypo colony and how this really kind of hurt China. In old imperialism, the European powers treated the rulers of the native countries with respect. But with the Industrial Revolution and the age of nationalism, Europe is now richer, it's stronger, and the governments have more direct power over the people because they have an endless supply of funds, they have the more advanced weapons. And the non-European empires, for the most part, were in decay, and they couldn't stand up to Europe. The two sides were unevenly matched. So basically, 75,000 English troops were able to maintain India for the British. And this was also the age of punitive bombardment. So non-European countries who were not cooperating would be bombarded until the local ruler would be forced to give in. So I want you to think about what was the most important reason for imperialism during this time period.